Welcome to Left Out, reality-based independent radio on WRCT 88.3 FM and on the World Wide Web, available at leftout.info. Left Out discusses the news from a perspective left out of the mainstream media. I'm Bob Harper.
I'm Danny Slater.
And today's program is produced by Matt Horniak. Listeners are, as usual, invited to call the program at 412-268-9728, or you can also send electronic mail to bob@leftout.info, and we'll monitor mail during the show.
We don't have any special announcements today. The only ones I'll just mention are that, as usual, Democracy Now! Is on every weekday at 8 a.m. here on WRCT. Free Speech Radio News is on every weekday at 5:30 p.m. And tomorrow's show on 6 o'clock, at 6 o'clock, is the Fight and Lefty Review. And after this show, another program about Wall Street is After the Bell, right after Left Out here on WRCT. So today we have a guest on the line. His name is Sam Harris. He's an author of a book that came out about a year and a half ago called The End of Faith, Religion, Terror, and the Future of Reason. Sam has gotten a lot of publicity lately for the book. His book has become a bestseller, and he's getting more interviews and so on. He was on C-SPAN a few days ago. So and both Bob and I looked at his talk on C-SPAN, found it very interesting, and decided to invite him on to Left Out. Sam, are you there?
Yeah. Thanks for having me, guys.
Welcome to Left Out.
So maybe we should just start out with, if you could briefly summarize the thesis of your book.
Well, I'm arguing that we're paying a terrible price for not subjecting religious beliefs to the same kinds of standards of evidence and argument that we subject all of the other beliefs to. We live in a society where religious faith is intruding upon social policy, blocking medical research, underwriting some of our international alliances, and internationally we are meandering into a civilizational conflict with the Muslim world, also animated by religious myth to an extraordinary degree, and we are unwilling to criticize the unjustified religious beliefs that are causing these kinds of conflicts and causing these kinds of distortions in our thinking about the world. And so I'm criticizing the taboos that prevent us from taking on religious belief to the degree that I think we should.
So the conventional wisdom is that, religion is an unalloyed good, and that some people misapply it, or in a misguided interpretation, but that doesn't say anything fundamental about religion itself. So I have a feeling that you have a somewhat different opinion about this, so I wonder if you might comment on that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing to say up front is that I don't deny that people have extraordinary experiences and extraordinarily positive experiences in the context of some religious ideology and some religious practice. And so we should want to understand those experiences. We can call them spiritual or mystical, for lack of better words. We should also want to understand and cultivate those factors that allow us to form strong communities and encourage ethical intuitions, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's a range of experience that traditionally has only been talked about in the context of religious faith that is crucial to the human enterprise. But what I'm arguing in my book is that people either have good reasons for what they believe or they don't. And if you have good reasons for what you believe, your beliefs are part of the dialogue of science. Speaking very broadly, I mean, that includes history, that includes every rational mode of discourse. And if there were good reasons to believe that Jesus was born of a virgin or was going to be coming back out of the clouds like a superhero sometime in the next 50 years, those beliefs would be part of our scientific worldview. And there's a good reason why they are not part of our scientific worldview, because the reasons for holding beliefs of that sort are tissue thin. I mean, the arguments people put forward for convictions like that the world is going to end and the Messiah is going to return, that the Quran literally emanated from the creator of the universe, all of these ideas, which are intrinsically divisive because they exclude other religious propositions with which they're incompatible, all of these ideas really lack credibility, and it's time we started talking about it.
So one of the things that, well, the book is got lots of examples of this, and it spans a wide range of consequences of these religious beliefs. The book begins with a description of a suicide bombing on a bus. That's one big part of the whole thing, and then later on you go into and talking about the 9/11 hijackers and what was driving them, and you also have chapters about things like medical issues, things like the anti-drug laws, trying to regulate what people do in their own, privacy of their own homes, homosexuality, a whole range of different types of phenomena. The issue of preventing the distribution of condoms in Africa and preventing the teaching of how to have safe sex. So all of these things are consequences of it. So they're all very different, and they all take place in different parts of the world. So, but it's just kind of a sweeping thesis where you try to tie this all together.
Right. Yeah. I mean, one thing to point out that unifies all of these diverse consequences is the proposition that really we have a choice between an open-ended conversation where human beings are willing to have their beliefs about the world revised and updated by new evidence and new arguments, or we in various modes of conversation put the blinders on and say there are certain core beliefs that are simply not susceptible to the usual criticism and the usual process of revision. And the only area of our discourse where we tolerate and encourage that latter mode is in religion. I mean, anyone who believes that Elvis is still alive, for instance, has and cannot produce good reasons for it, is just swiftly marginalized in our culture, because we all recognize that strong conviction, completely devoid of evidence, is the sign that really something is wrong with your mind. But you can believe that Jesus is going to come back out of the clouds in your lifetime and have no more evidence, and not only are you praised for it, you can be promoted to political office. Would that be in your founding notion for your campaign?
So, I thought of something clever to say, but now I forgot what it was.
The thing I wanted to take up, though, is that you seem to take a fairly broad view of what science would be, because because I sort of equate science with materialism or materialistic explanation, and not identify it with rationality per se. So you seem to be saying, well, if there are rational arguments for religious belief, then they would be part of science. They're not part of science, therefore there are no rational arguments for religious belief. But the fact, I'm not sure that the last thing works, right? Because presumably, I'm not a religious person myself, but presumably someone who is religious would argue, well, that the arguments and the issues are not material, so they're not relevant to science. And so, what are you saying?
Well, I think science does not presuppose any metaphysical commitment to materialism per se. I mean, if dualism is true, if we really do have souls that float free of the brain after death, then a completed science would admit that into evidence. Now, the fact is that the evidence for souls floating free of the brain after death is in short supply. And insofar as we have evidence for that proposition, we should be evaluating it and talking about it. And so I'm open-minded on that subject. Likewise, with all manner of strange thing like telepathy. Who knows? There's some data on telepathy. Some people with scientific credentials have been convinced by it. It's treated like intellectual pornography in most universities, and so it's not a particularly fruitful realm of discourse at the moment. But either telepathy exists or it doesn't, and if it exists and we're willing to explore it, that too will be part of the data and discourse of science. And it may be there may be a material explanation. There may be a fundamentally spookier explanation, but I don't think that science presupposes any particular metaphysical worldview. What it does presuppose, though, is a desire to jettison dogma wherever you can find it. I mean, dogmatism is the antithesis of a scientific frame of mind, and yet it is the core of the religious frame of mind.
Right. So I think we can agree that critical inquiry is your core point, and I agree with that.
I have a comment on another thing you just said. I mean, you're saying that we need to, quote, treat them like they treat people who have these beliefs as though they just believe in Elvis, for example, or some other preposterous thing. But aren't we already doing that in a sense? I mean, isn't that what, for example, the fact that evolution is being taught, or I don't remember the whole history of the rulings about evolution, but up until recently, evolution was being taught in the schools, and creationism is not being taught in the schools, much to the chagrin of a lot of religious people. And now they've fought back vigorously, and now they're trying to impose these superstitious beliefs and trying to incorporate that into a science curriculum. But I'm not sure I think you're making a good point, but what's the course of action? Because I think that we're already doing a lot. Well, I mean, I certainly am, but I mean, it doesn't seem to be working.
Well, we're actually, the first thing to recognize is that we are outnumbered to a shocking degree in this country. 83% of Americans claim to believe that Jesus literally rose from the dead. 68% of Americans believe that Satan literally exists, and when you select just college graduates, that number only goes down to 64% who believe that Satan literally exists and leads people to sin. Now hold that alongside the fact that only about 12% of Americans believe that life evolved from natural causes without the intrusion of a creator God. So the picture that emerges is of a society that is really not disposed to think very critically about the evolving discourse of specifically about evolution and the emergence of life that has occurred in the last 100 years and in the last 50 years since molecular biology. It's mind-boggling, the level of ignorance and the commitment to ignorance, the smug and unctuous and moralizing commitment to ignorance that is so much of the discourse of the religious right in our country. And the fact that our children may one day be taught intelligent design in biology class should be galling to all of us. So it is a problem. It's a problem of social and psychological engineering, how you get people talking sense when the most sensible people are so outnumbered. But there are a few things we should recognize. One is the picture is very different in Western Europe. I mean, Western Europe has managed, for a variety of reasons, to purge its political discourse and social discourse of these most frank ejaculations of religious dogmatism. You cannot be a politician in France, for instance, or Sweden, who thanks God at the end of his speech. And that's a good thing. And to thank God at the end of your speech, you're going to sound like someone who just thanks Zeus or Poseidon. And one thing I recommend to all of your listeners is, just change the word God wherever you hear it in public discourse in our country to Zeus or Poseidon or Thor or any one of the other dead gods who nobody believes in, and you'll see just how strange our discourse is.
And what I think is worse is that if you want to go on the same line, I mean, you certainly couldn't be elected to public office in any significant to any significant extent if you profess that you don't actually believe in God. You can forget about that. Then you're tantamount to some sort of a criminal or a subhuman entity. Very few people have the nerve for that reason to even admit having any questions about these matters.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's actually the most stigmatized subgroup that has been polled on. I mean, people have been asked by pollsters if a presidential candidate from your party, your own party, were put forward who was qualified but happened to be black or homosexual or Catholic or a woman or an atheist, would you vote for that person? And it's only the atheist who could not get a majority, even in his own party, stipulating that he's actually well qualified.
That's pathetic.
Huh.
We're talking with Sam Harris, who is the author of a best-selling book called "The End of Faith: Religion, Terror, and the Future of Reason." Listeners are welcome to call us as ever at 412-268-9728, or to send electronic mail to bob@leftout.info. Phone number again is 412-268-9728. Danny.
So one of the things that, superficial reading of your book, which is all I've done, might lead me to conclude is that there's kind of this blaming of, for example, Islam for a lot of things. For example, you begin the book with describing a suicide bombing, and you point out that, rightly so, that, well, we don't know anything about the person who just perpetrated this hideous crime, but except, well, he's a Muslim. And I agree with that. You don't know if he's an engineer, or if he's a man or woman, or lots of other things. But one thing you're pretty sure to be right about is that he's a Muslim. But the thing is that doesn't really explain, the fact that the suicide bombings are a relatively recent thing. I mean, it wasn't just something that happened. It started happening just because the Palestinians felt like, blowing themselves up and a bunch of other people. It's connected to the oppression and, in my view, the genocide, the slow genocide of the Palestinians that's been going on for decades there in Israel. And so it's, I think, misleading, and maybe this is not what you're saying. Maybe you can clarify this to say that, well, it's the fact that they're Muslims, they're doing this. It's related and it's connected, but it's got to be also connected to the whole oppressive situation over there and the crimes being committed by the other side.
Well, let me ask you a question, Danny. I'm not discounting the terrible circumstances that the Palestinians live in as a variable, but if religion is not the difference that makes the difference, where are the Palestinian Christian suicide bombers? There are tens of thousands of Palestinian Christians who live in the same deplorable circumstances. They suffer the same checkpoints and the same humiliations. To my knowledge, there has not been a single Palestinian Christian suicide bomber. And I'm arguing that's not an accident. I'm arguing that if you look at the doctrine of Islam, the mainstream doctrine of Islam, it contains these ideas of martyrdom and jihad that really make sense of the unique character of Muslim violence that we see now. Now, it's not that no one else has ever committed suicidal violence under any circumstances, but Islam really makes it seem like a sensible thing to do given the theology.
So I wonder, since I'm not a theologian, I would, and this is a fairly provocative statement, I wondered if, first of all, you could back that up by giving us a little more information about what you see in the Quran, for example, of where that arises. And second of all, I would like you also to react to the comment that other religions, like you can find similar calls to violence in the Old Testament, for example. Right.
Yeah, those are all good points. The larger point is that what I'm arguing is that people really believe this stuff, and that people like ourselves, secularists or religious moderates, are not in a very good position to appreciate that. We really, most of us, can't imagine believing that if we fly a plane into a building and kill the right people and die in the process, that we're going to wind up in paradise with 72 virgins, et cetera, et cetera. But people really do believe this stuff, and they are telling us they believe it, and they are sacrificing their lives in a way that is only rational in light of those beliefs or similar beliefs. So that's the big picture. And the details do matter because, for instance, you mentioned the Bible. It's true that the Old Testament, the books like Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Exodus and 2 Samuel are absolutely barbaric books and contain explicit directives to kill people for theological crimes. The issue, the difference between the Bible and the Quran is the Bible is a really vast and self-contradictory book, and it's possible to it does not have a coherent message, really, and you can use parts of it. You certainly can use Jesus in half his moods to repudiate all the rest of the Bible and develop a very tolerant and otherworldly and non-political religion, as many liberal Christians do. Now there's the other Jesus, who's the wrathful reaper of souls, who's going to come back very much as he's portrayed in the Left Behind novels and just throw people into the fiery pit. That is a Jesus who also can be found in the Bible. But the difference with the Quran is that it is a much shorter book. It is a much more unified message. And the message is really this, that infidels are fit only for the fires of hell, and that whatever gains you see them making in this life are only apparent. Rest assured they're going to be punished and mocked and not forgiven and not reprieved by the Creator of the universe, who, if he had wanted them to be saved, would have rightly guided them, but he didn't. He cursed them with their doubts, and therefore it is fitting that they suffer for eternity. And one principle that is articulated in Islam to an extraordinary degree, it's not articulated as much in the Quran, more in the Hadith, which is the commentarial tradition that recounts the sayings and actions of the Prophet. One principle is this idea of jihad and martyrdom, the idea that death in defense of the faith, that defending the faith from criticism even is a moral obligation for every Muslim, and to die in that process is the greatest thing that could possibly happen to you, and that is just articulated ad nauseum in the Hadith. I mean, there are phrases like, paradise is in the shadow of swords, and he that dies while fighting in Allah's cause is the most exalted. And I mean, there are countless versions of this kind of thing, and it is. The other thing to recognize is that Islam is at a different moment in its history. It has not had a Reformation. It has not had 2 centuries of confrontation with secularism and a scientific worldview, and therefore it is as though that we are facing the Christians of the 14th century right now. We have people who are animated to an extraordinary degree by their religious mythology, and it happens to be a mythology that makes a very ready sense out of religious conflict and suicidal violence.
So why does this come up just now, though? Going back to Danny's point, I mean, so, the religion of Islam has been around for, I don't know, more than 1,000 years, 1,500 years, something like that. And it seems, although maybe that's just my impression, but it seems that these acts that you attribute to the religion are really relatively recent.
Well, they're not recent in terms of conflict between Islam and the West. What is recent is the spread of the technology that allows people to turn themselves into bombs or hijack airplanes, and I mean this is all very very recent. And the emergence of this suicide bombing specifically occurred during the civil war in Lebanon and was inspired by Hezbollah and. But suicidal behavior predates that, and it's also important to point out that this is not merely something that happens between Islam and the West, although that's what's most noticeable to us. Muslims do this to other Muslims without our involvement. When you just
as a matter of doctrinal disagreement, you mean?
Yeah, and the same kind of orgy of suicidal violence is apparent. I mean, the war between Iran and Iraq was characterized on the Iranian side with mothers sending their sons out to clear minefields with their lives. Just by the tens of thousands, kids were sent across minefields, and there was just this, a sacrament was made of it. I mean, this was not something that was directed at us, and it's not something that many of us know about, and yet. Given the requisite beliefs, this is perfectly rational behavior. I mean, just imagine if you actually believed that death was a total illusion and your son was going to go straight to paradise and not only get there himself but pave the way for you and your entire family. It's a completely rational thing to do. The problem for us is that we are so reluctant to admit that people actually believe this stuff that we kind of endlessly look for other explanations when they're telling us why they're doing these things.
So if we look at the other side, though, wasn't it also gloriously heroic to embark on the Crusades and go to the Middle East and try to kill and eradicate the non-Christian believers?
Yeah, it was, and the religious.
So again,
it's not
Islam particularly.
What was that? Yeah, the religious motives for that were certainly operative at the time. The Crusades were a faith-based initiative to an extraordinary degree.
Indeed.
But it's just that the thing to point out is that the doctrine of martyrdom and jihad, or martyrdom and crusade, is not as explicit in Christianity, certainly, and therefore it's easier to be a Christian who ignores that particular pernicious logic of faith, and it's much harder to be a Muslim who ignores the obligation of jihad.
So I'm not so sure I agree with that. I mean, it seems more like, to me, like we notice, and it's particularly topical at the moment, but I mean, there's an enormous population of Muslims in the world. There must be billions, or nearly.
1.3 billion.
Yeah, I mean, if you go, I mean, it's a tremendous swath of the world. So I can't really believe your argument that somehow, Muslims are more compelled to adhere to, heroic stories in the name of faith than let's say Christians are. I mean, it doesn't seem plausible to me.
Well, let me just give you a few details to back that up. One is, the truth is, we really don't know what the great majority of Muslims believe.
Well, I don't.
Yeah, but the polling has not been done to the degree that it's been done in the West. But to the degree that it has been done, there are some terrifying results that we should talk about. The polling on support for suicide bombing. I mean, in tens of thousands of Muslims in 9 countries were asked whether they supported suicide bombing in defense of the faith against civilian non-combatants. Okay, so there are a few features here we should point out. We're talking about killing non-combatants deliberately through the use of suicide bombing. Suicide being something that many Muslims believe is proscribed in the Quran. And the percentages of people in the countries polled, in Lebanon and Jordan and Somalia, were shocking. I mean, in Lebanon it was something like 75%. Now, another thing to point out is that the countries where the percentages would have even been higher wouldn't even let the question be asked. So in countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, we don't even have the polling data. But let's just imagine that let's take the lowest country, the most secularized country. I think it was Turkey, where something like 20% thought it was justified or sometimes justified. That's all. If that was representative of the Muslim world, 1.3 billion people, we still have a terrific problem on our hands. So it's I wouldn't be too optimistic about what the general cast of mind is in the House of Islam around these issues. And in recent weeks we've seen tens of thousands of Muslims gather in the streets calling for the deaths of cartoonists in Denmark for merely depicting the Prophet. Now that's not behavior that is really that we should find consoling. But I would agree with you. Our hope has to be placed at some level in the reasonable voices in the Muslim world, wherever they are, and we have to find some way of encouraging their dialogue and empowering them.
Yeah. So another thing. First, let me mention the phone number if you want to give us a call. It's 412-268-9728. There's a chapter in your book where you talk about it's critical of some of the liberals, specifically Noam Chomsky. You spend a good deal of a couple of pages talking about or trying to analyze his views and trying to square them with what you see as the facts. And I guess Chomsky, for example, complained about for example, Clinton's bombing of a drug factory. That Chomsky then pointed out that that caused
Sudan. Yeah, mm-hmm.
It caused the deaths were terrible consequences for hundreds of thousands of people who weren't able to get the drugs that were produced by that factory. And you kind of ridicule that as, well, there's also a lot of things that the U.S. could have done that they didn't do. Does that make the U.S. culpable as well, and so on? But, okay, I mean, maybe that was a weak argument that Chomsky made at that particular point. I'll let you respond in a second. But there are other things that have happened, like Madeleine Albright declaring just forthrightly that the death of 500,000 Iraqi children was a cost that was worth what was trying to be achieved by the U.S. policy. So I don't find that statement defensible, and I find it heinous. And as heinous as the calls for the death of the cartoonists and a lot of other things that you're claiming the Muslims are doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'm not aware of that statement that Albright made, and I would agree with you that also would be heinous, except you have to locate, I think you're misattributing the cause there. The cause of the deprivations of the Iraqi people during the sanctions regime was the fact that they were ruled by a sociopathic dictator and his arguably psychotic sons who were diverting billions of dollars in aid to build palaces and do all the other things they were doing that were reprehensible. The question for me is, what do people actually intend to do? I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which we inadvertently kill people in this world, and that is not as, I mean, given that it's inadvertent, our culpability is rather different than when we intend to kill people. And what I take Chomsky to task for is that he really does not factor in the role of human intentions in his analysis. So he's merely after body count. So he can extrapolate from our bombing of a pharmaceutical plant in the Sudan in the middle of the night and say that perhaps hundreds of thousands of children died from preventable diseases as a result, and then hold us accountable to that number and compare that number without any modification to the mere 3,000 souls who lost their lives on September 11th, and then say essentially that Clinton is worse than Osama bin Laden. And it's a ridiculous thing to say, because the question is, what are people really attempting in this world, and what will they do when they get their hands on the most destructive technology? This technology is proliferating. We cannot uninvent it. We're not stopping its proliferation, and we're no more likely to stop the proliferation of nuclear and biological weapons than we are likely to stop the traffic in drugs ultimately. And therefore, people are telling us what they intend to do, what aspirations they desperately hope to realize, and these aspirations are rather different. And when you look at somebody like Osama bin Laden, if you imagine what he would do if he had a long-range nuclear weapons, for instance, he is not the moral equivalent of George Bush. I mean, George Bush has the weapons, and he's not nuking the Muslim world. If Osama bin Laden had the weapons, we should be convinced that killing millions upon millions of innocent bystanders would not pose a problem for him.
Okay, Sam.
Yeah, we have a call.
If I may interrupt, we have a call on the line.
Sure.
We have from Joe for Sam Harris. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I've spent the last 3 years spending time in the Middle East, and have studied U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. I just want to say I think it's really misleading to think that religion is really the core conflict there. The core conflict to be U.S. imperialism, U.S. overthrowing of democratically elected government, U.S. Resource extraction, and then the Arab people's resistance to that. Certainly religion is used on both sides. It's used to justify the acts of imperialism, and it's also used to justify acts of resistance. But martyrdom and giving one's life in the struggle for freedom is an ethos, as old as human history, and the specific manifestation of it in the form of suicide bombings is really only a tactical element of a resistance movement facing overwhelming military superiority on the part of U.S. and Israel.
So, Sam, I was going to say something similar, but the caller said it far better than I would have. So, Sam,
yeah.
I wonder if you might respond to that.
Sure. Yeah, very well put. Two responses. One is we should look at who's actually blowing themselves up and try to map this account of their grievances with the West onto their personal biographies. when you look, for instance, at the 19 hijackers, these were not guys who had been mistreated by the arrogance and colonialism of the West. They were not people who had no other economic or social opportunities. In fact, many of them were educated in the West. They were all college graduates. Most of them were middle class or better. They were not people who spent a lot of time agitating for regime change in the Middle East, and they were not people who were obsessed about our propping up dictators in the Middle East for our own nefarious purposes. These were guys who spent a tremendous amount of time at their local mosque in Hamburg talking about the pleasures that await martyrs in paradise.
So Joe, Oh, go ahead.
We're fatally confused if we think that the people who are blowing themselves up are, by and large, freedom fighters most agitated by our meddling in the Middle East. And the people who are most agitated by our meddling in the Middle East are agitated very much in theological terms. They're not concerned about oil. They're not concerned about their own democratic processes. They're concerned about the presence of infidels near Muslim holy sites, for instance. That's on the top of Osama bin Laden's list of grievances. And so we have to realize that our world is balkanized, certainly between the West and Islam, very much along theological lines.
Joe, would you care to respond to that?
Sure. I just think that his ideas are very dangerous, considering this is the frame that Bush and the U.S. government wants us to take, that this is a clash of civilizations and it's, Christian fighting these evil Muslims, when indeed the U.S. government has been more responsible for far more deaths of civilians than these supposed terrorists have ever been. So I would ask, is it something in Christianity that makes people want to bomb Arab countries and drop bombs from planes? Is it something about Judaism that leads these settlers in the West Bank to, attack civilians on a regular basis and steal their land? I don't think that it is, and I think it's a very racist and misleading idea that only supports U.S. imperialism and makes any kind of resolution further away.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Joe, for calling. Sam, perhaps you might like to respond.
Yeah, there's a bunch to respond to.
Okay.
That's all quite jumbled, really, because first of all, the president administration is not, while we may fear their Christian underpinnings, is not talking about a clash of civilizations and is not demonizing Islam. And I would argue they're not appreciating the problem of Islam, at least not overtly as much as they should. I mean, George Bush, whenever he's given a chance, will talk about Islam being a religion of peace. Now, Islam is absolutely not a religion of peace, and it's time we and Muslims started understanding that. The other thing I'd like to address is that there's nothing at all racist about what I'm saying. I'm talking about the consequences of certain ideas. I'm talking about John Walker Lind, the white guy from Marin County who went off to fight with the Taliban. So I'm not talking about Arabs. I'm not talking about any ethnicity. And the other thing is that the caller is just not recognizing who is doing these things. Once again, when you look at who in the Palestinian territories is blowing themselves up or supporting martyrdom operations, these are not the poorest people. They are by and large the most well off. At least they're middle class. They're without a doubt the most literate people, and they are not the Christians. And while I say many critical things about Christianity in my writings, Christianity does not happen to have the character of a death cult at the moment, and that's an important difference.
Well, my producer asks a very really relevant point, which is, well, what about the Christians who go out killing doctors who perform procedures that they don't approve of?
Well,
and they do it in the name of Christ. They do it in the name of Christ.
Yeah, that is motivated by a religious dogma, explicitly so. They're only concerned about abortion to the degree that they are because they think the soul enters the zygote at the moment of conception, and that these embryos have to be protected the way you would protect 10-year-old little girls.
Right.
It's a ridiculous idea, and it's motivating them to kill people.
Let me make another.
Okay.
I want to just relate back to the caller. You talk about intentionality, and you feel that certain acts by the U.S. Are not as they're classified differently because of the intent was different, or the intent wasn't just to kill. But if you look around a little more carefully at what the U.S. is doing in both Iraq and elsewhere, I mean, they have acted in the most egregious. They've made the most egregious choices to kill. I mean, they've used, for example, they're using landmines, advocating use of landmines when that's an internationally, banned thing, except by the U.S. The cluster bombs, that's for little kids to pick up and blow them up. When they dropped those cluster bombs, they knew.
Or napalm
They knew
in the
that
desert.
thousands of kids were going to pick up those little toy,
Right.
they look like toys, and they blow themselves up. They knew that. The intention had to be there to do that. Okay, they're using napalm. And and you talk about nuclear weapons, the bombing of Hiroshima, that was, the reason they did that, and it was apparently not because of any strategic reason, and that's been analyzed tremendously in great detail by many people. It wasn't to win the war, accelerate the war. The war was over. It was to show some sort of sign to the Russians that, well, we mean business now. We have a nuclear bomb and we can use it. Well, they killed 100,000 people for that little demonstration. I mean, okay, the intent was to do.
How does that bear on my argument? I wouldn't deny any of that, and I mean, it's rather obvious that we did many things in our military engagements, for instance, in World War II, that would be unthinkable now, given the degree to which we are informed about the details on the ground in real time in every one of these conflicts. I mean, we just could not, we would not do it. They were absolutely war crimes, and yet no one, for instance, is arguing that was not a just war. I mean, it is true that occasionally in the course of human events, your enemy is so evil and poses such a manifest threat to the good people on the right side of the issues that you have to go to war, and it just so happens that we have no perfect way of fighting war, and collateral damage occurs.
Yeah, but I don't agree with that, because I think that the use of cluster bombs is all collateral damage. It's all collateral damage.
No impulse to defend the use of cluster bombs. I mean, I don't see why you would think I would defend the use of cluster bombs.
But no, you're not defending it. But I'm saying that it's you're trying to make some sort of distinction between the mindset of a Muslim whose intention is to kill people in these ways, and a military person who drops cluster bombs whose intention is to kill little kids. I mean, I don't know. I don't see that distinction.
There are all kinds of ideologies that could get you to kill little kids.
Mm-hmm.
You could be raised to think that killing little kids is an important way of achieving your ends in this world, and I mean, their ideas have consequences, and all I'm arguing is that our religious ideas are uniquely immune to criticism because it is taboo to criticize a person's religious faith, and yet they are uniquely divisive because they one, posit differences between people which cause people to morally identify only with their religious group, and they're divisive in the sense that some religions, some more than others, give explicit directives to kill people in certain circumstances. For instance, if they happen to draw a picture of your prophet, as we see in this cartoon scandal. I mean, this cartoon scandal is perfectly uninterpretable but for a specific religious idea, which is don't depict the prophet under any circumstances. If you drew Christ, merely drew him, you would not get these calls for the heads of cartoonists to roll. And there are many instances of this where a specific religious idea leads to violence that would not otherwise occur. And on a daily basis, we're seeing people blow themselves up in Iraq, for instance. I'm not arguing about the justness of that war, but I'm saying that there's a style of violence there. There's an influx of people willing to die from Jordan and Syria and Saudi Arabia, middle-class people with other opportunities in this world, who are willing to die, and their parents are willing to celebrate their deaths, and this is only interpretable in light of what they believe. And what they believe is you get straight to paradise by dying in those circumstances.
Okay, so let's say we accept that premise just for the sake of discussion. Then I think the question becomes, and I'm actually surprised to hear myself arguing this, the question becomes, so amongst all of you're arguing that religious belief has this, has these consequences. Let's just stipulate that that's the case. But then is this the most important issue that we could be worrying about? I mean, if I go to Danny's point, aren't these other issues much larger? Isn't the tens of thousands of people that we've killed in the invasion of Iraq and much more significant than the dozens that are killed by various suicide bombers?
Well, no, I don't think. I think the religious polarization of our world. I think. Ask yourself, what would be the greatest thing we could achieve as a human community in the near term? I think it would be to have human beings everywhere merely identified as human beings. It's where we could take the whole of our species as our moral community and really be united. Now, ask yourself, what are the obstacles to that happening? There are things like racism, there's nationalism, there are various forms of tribalism, but the most intractable form of tribalism and the most motivating to people is religious tribalism, where you have societies breaking down along religious lines over and over again, and leading to conflict and leading to the most irrational uses of human resources and human discourse. I mean, forget about the war on terrorism and our conflict with the Middle East. Just think about what religion does within our own country, where half of the oxygen of our political discourse is taken up with religious infatuations. I mean, the fact that we spend 1 second talking about gay marriage in this country when we have all of these other problems, epidemiological problems, economic problems, it's absolute madness. And it's religious madness.
Go ahead, Danny.
Well, I was going to go on a little bit of a tangent to a slightly different topic that you talked about in your lecture on C-SPAN, which you elaborated on the absurdity of the trying to protect a fertilized egg or an embryo. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe you could just give that little analysis you gave. It had to do with a soul that would split apart and come together again. It had,
right.
How the killing a fly, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, the issue of stem cell research it's a very discrete topic we can talk about. I mean, it is a line of research in biology that any biologist will tell you, any honest biologist who's not confounded by some competing religious dogma will tell you that it is one of the most promising lines of research in biology to develop medical therapies, and yet it is not being funded at the federal level because of this concern that we will destroy in the process 3-day-old human embryos to do this research. And people think that people are concerned about this because they think the soul enters the zygote at the moment of conception, and therefore you can't sacrifice one soul to save the soul of an 8-year-old girl who's got diabetes or full-body burns or men and women with Parkinson's disease or any of the other conditions that tens of millions of people suffer from at this moment and for which stem cell research seems to be the best line of research. You can't use the interest of one soul to trump another soul. Well, this is when you look at the details, and we never have to look at the details because of the respect that's given to religious faith and religious-based morality here. But when you look at the details, you ask yourself, what is a 3-day-old human embryo? It's a collection of 150 cells, the size of a pinhead, totally unorganized. There's no brain. There's no nervous system. And just compare that to another system of physical complexity, like a fly. I mean, if you think 150 cells is a lot of cells that we should worry about, you should be rather startled to hear that there are 100,000 cells in the brain of a housefly. Now, we would kill houseflies all day long if it stood a chance of saving one little girl with full-body burns. We do kill houseflies all day long, and no one loses sleep over it. We should lose sleep over houseflies before we lose sleep over 3-day-old human embryos. If we know anything at all about the relationship between physical complexity and the possibility of having interests, having experience, the possibility of suffering, anything at all, and yet the discourse on this subject is completely arrested by religious dogmatism. and quite literally the lives of tens of millions of people in our country alone hang in the balance.
Well, that's an interesting point. This brings me, we have about 5 minutes remaining. Let me mention again that the phone number to call if you wish to talk with Sam Harris is 412-268-9728, and we have 5 more minutes. So, Sam, I wanted to also ask you, going back to what we started in the very beginning of our discussion, was as we commented that, being an atheist or even disclaiming any particular interest or in religion is enough to disqualify you from public office. Now, one of the reasons that has at least a rational form to it is if you ask someone, well, why do they believe that? And I think ultimately, if you get down to it, they would say essentially, you can't be an ethical person if you don't have religion. And
right.
So I wonder whether you might like to comment on that.
Yeah, well, this is really the keystone myth, I think, in our discourse that keeps religion in such high esteem, even among otherwise moderate or even secular people. This idea that somehow, without endorsing the idea that one of our books was created by the creator of the universe, we would lose our moral underpinnings and people would start behaving badly. There is no evidence for this whatsoever. You can see the problems here simply by looking at what's going on in Western Europe, where the most atheistic societies, a society like Sweden, where something like 60 or 80% of people are atheists.
Or the most humane.
They're the most. They have, by every indicator you would want to look at, levels of violent crime, levels of charity to the developing world. They're far ahead of us. But the other thing is that we have to recognize that we use our own ethical intuitions to decide what is good in the Bible, for instance. I mean, if you look at the Bible, there are all these barbaric passages that we discussed earlier that very few people take seriously. Actually, some people do take seriously, and they're the people who want homosexuals to be put to death and basically want a world very much like the world we saw in Afghanistan under the Taliban. But very few of us take those passages seriously because we've decided it's unethical to put people to death for sex crimes or for sex that we don't approve of, or for not being a virgin on your wedding night, for instance. And we listen to Jesus as he's talking on the Sermon on the Mount, and he enunciates the golden rule, and we recognize, that's a great ethical principle. But it's our own ethical intuitions and our own conversation with others that is the gold standard by which we recognize ethical wisdom. And ethics clearly precede religion. I mean, even monkeys have a proto-ethical framework. I mean, monkeys recognize violations of fairness, for instance, and they recognize reciprocity, and they treat one another well and their family members better in a way that they will not treat other species. And so our ethics are a natural phenomenon emerging out of our embeddedness in the natural world, and they are things we can talk about intelligently without dogmatic adherence to first-century philosophy.
Well, that we'll have to finish up our conversation today. Our time has run out. Sam Harris, author of The End of Faith, Religion, Terror, and the Future of Reason. Thank you very much for being a guest on Left Out. I very much enjoyed our program.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you all for listening to Left Out. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time. And thank you to Matt Horniak for producing today's show.